Hello, my name is Ryan McMillan, and this will be a vulnerability assessment of Robert Fowler servers. In this presentation, we will discuss the Windows and Linux servers that were set up by Robert Fowler, and we will look at the security of the services that were required to be installed and running on both the Windows and Linux boxes. So the first thing we're going to do is look at the methodology used to scan both of these systems. So both of these servers were scanned using Nmap on a Kali Linux box. And what Nmap does for us is scans both the servers and it'll return what services are open and what port that they are running on. An Nmap quick scan was used for both of the servers, for Windows and Linux. The Linux box located at 192.168.2.36. The Windows server located at 192.168.2.37. For the firewall on Linux and for AppArmor, both of those were manually checked as Nmap is unable to scan those. So for IP tables, a guest account was made and I was able to log in through that and check IP tables. And we were also able to check AppArmor and whether or not it was enabled. The last method used was the Greenbone vulnerability scanner. And what this does is scans both the Windows and the Linux box of Robert Fowler and lets us know if there's any vulnerabilities that it finds in both the servers. And then it provides us a report of the vulnerabilities it finds and defines whether or not they are of low risk, medium risk, or high risk. So the first thing we're going to look at is the Linux box and specifically the Nmap scan and results that we got from it. So on this slide on the right here is a screenshot of the last Nmap scan done on Robert Fowler's Linux server. The scan was done using Zenmap and a quick scan. And as you can see, most of the required services that needed to be stood up are available, such as SSH, domain, which is DNS, we have POP3S, we have IMAPs, etc. So the first thing to note is the services that were just not available whatsoever. Those services include SNTPS, PostgreSQL, and HTTPS. We did multiple scans or I did multiple scans to ensure that the information was consistent, and I got no response from the services after all the scans. So those all three were made unavailable. The other issue to note is that the unsecure versions of IMAPS, POP3S, and HTTPS were still available. So while fortunately IMAPS and POP3S were actually available, the secure versions, HTTP was available, but the secure version of it was not available at all. So if you look on the right, you can see in the Zenmap scan that we have HTTP over port 80, but we don't have HTTPS. We have POP3, the insecure version of that over port 110, and we still have the insecure version of IMAP running on port 143. What this means in regards to overall security is that a lot of information is going to be sent in clear text. For example, on POP3, man-in-the-middle attacks can happen, and the emails can be intercepted. And those intercepted emails, if not done over POP3S and encrypted properly, they can be read by attackers. Same thing goes with IMAP, same thing goes with HTTP. Anything intercepted, none of it's going to be encrypted, and it's all going to be pretty much available for the hacker to read. And that's the opposite of what we want, which is why it's important to have encrypted services running and unencrypted services disabled. The next thing we're going to look at here, and probably the biggest vulnerability in the server, both of his servers that I found, was the firewall for the Linux server. So as mentioned earlier, the firewall was checked manually by logging in and doing a iptables-l command, which lists all the firewall rules that have been input for IP tables. And if you look on the right, you'll see the results of the iptables-l command and the results. And the results are pretty bad, very bad, if anything. One of the first things to note is the default policy for input, which is incoming connections, was set to accept. The biggest thing that we were told and should have been implemented first of all is that the input policy should be automatically set to drop. So if any connection comes from a source that is not input into the input chain, it would be dropped, or if it comes from a protocol that we don't accept. However, with the default policy of accept, as shown here, basically any protocol is able to contact and talk to the Linux server. The other issue, well, really isn't an issue as much as it is just confusing, is the one rule that is input is a rule to accept TCP connections from literally anywhere, and the connections that it allows are new and established, which means that usually if it's just an established connection, it only allows connections from IPs or from sources that have previously had connections or have a current connection with the server. But with the new rule, that means that any new service or protocol, can talk to the server. And thanks to the default policy of accept on the input chain, it's going to be allowed. And this is especially frightening, especially in regards to protocols like SSH, where when you input them into IP tables, you want to have a well-defined list of what IPs can and cannot SSH into your server. And right now, it appears that basically anyone can do that, and there's nothing stopping them. So this just means that the server itself is completely vulnerable to a variety of attacks from all different protocols and angles, and is a huge concern for me when I look at the overall vulnerability of the server. The last thing that we needed to look at that was annualized manually was AppArmor. The results from checking the status of AppArmor are shown on the right, and they are unremarkable to say the least. The AppArmor service is up and it's running, and as you can see, the module's loaded and the profiles are loaded and in enforced mode. So that's about one of the few things that was running correctly. Now let's take a quick look at the Windows server, and I say quick look because, well, not many of the services, if any, were running. So for the Windows server, a Nmap scan was also done from the Kali Linux box. The server was located at 192.168.2.37. And on the right, you can see the results of that scan and, well, the lack of results. Multiple scans were done on this server over multiple days to check and make sure that Robert had had time to implement the services and have them up and running. However, the results were always the same. The server didn't have any services up and running at any point that checks were done. And so security measures or the overall vulnerability of the server can't properly be assessed in the first place because access to the server is non-existent at this time. I will have it noted that there was a manual check performed on the firewall. There's a guest account for the server that was created and logged into, and when the firewall was checked, it was turned on. However, a more thorough scan of the firewall and whether or not it was the root cause of the services not showing up on an Nmap scan was never done, so it can't really be determined if that was the cause. The last tool that was used to assess the security of Robert Fowler's servers was the Greenbone assessment vulnerability assessment tool. What this tool does for us is scans both the Windows and the Linux boxes and reports back any vulnerabilities that it finds on the servers. It categorizes these threats, these vulnerabilities that it finds, into 3 threat levels. That's high, medium, and low. High threat levels, of course, represent what you could basically say is a critical security flaw in the system that needs to be fixed immediately. Medium is not as pertinent of a vulnerability, but is still something that should draw concern and attention and be fixed. And of course, low is going to be the lowest threat level. So it's not necessarily the most attention grabbing security issue, but it is also something that would need to be addressed in the short term, depending on the vulnerability. So as you can see, the results were also unremarkable, just like AppArmor. There were 0 results on all 3 threat levels for all high, medium, and low. So in regards to the Linux server, this is a good thing. Um, it doesn't really help us much with the overall assessment of the Windows server because I don't believe that Greenbone would be able to actually contact that server in the first place to check for scan or to scan. There were 6 results that were filtered out. Just thought I'd mention that, even though they don't have a impact on the overall assessment of the servers. So now we're going to go ahead and take a look at the recommendations and fixes for the vulnerabilities that we did find. So when looking at the recommendations and fixes for the Linux server, the first and most important thing that needs to be done is changing the default input chain policy on IP tables. I've gone ahead and listed the command for that, which is sudo iptables-a input-j drop. And at least for the time being, until the other rules are implemented correctly, this will buy Robert some time as it won't allow any connections from any outside sources. It'll just automatically drop them. The next thing that needs to be done is proper rules for all services need to be put into IP tables. So since the default policy right now is accept, that explains why the Nmap scan showed the results that it did. That's why every service basically has probably been enabled. And that being the case, I wouldn't be surprised if when the default policy is set to drop, none of those connections will be made available, none of those services, and an Nmap scan would show accordingly with 0 results. So rules for each and one of the services do need to be applied in IP tables. Otherwise, they're all going to be immediately dropped once the default input chain rule is changed. The next thing that needs to be fixed is the IMAP and POP3 services, more specifically the unsecure services that were made available. While I know IMAPs and POP3S were successfully turned on, at least based on the Nmap scan, the IMAP and POP3 services are still available. And first off, they need to be blocked in IP tables if possible. And Robert needs to also check his Dovecot configuration file. In the config file, there is the option to enable and disable both IMAP and POP3, the secure and unsecure versions of both. So the unsecure version needs to be disabled, and this is usually located in the etc dovecot dot config file. And the last thing to do that we recommend or that I recommend, is to ensure that postfix and PostgreSQL have both been properly installed. As mentioned earlier, the Nmap scan showed neither of these services are running, and the only possible issue that I can think of is they're just not installed at all. So a simple apt-get install command for both postfix and PostgreSQL can be done, and both of the services will then be installed and running on the Linux server. For the Windows server, we're really unable to give any security recommendations or fixes due to the fact that none of the services showed up on a Nmap scan of the server. But we figured, or I figured that maybe I could address the reason these services aren't running or take a guess at it. One of the first possible things is that the firewall isn't preventing services from functioning correctly. It's recommended that Robert goes into the Windows firewall settings and ensures that services that need to be running are being allowed through the rule set in the Windows firewall, and make sure that none of them are disabled or being blocked. The other recommendation that I have is to ensure that the services are properly enabled and installed through IIS. So logging in through the IIS, or logging into Windows and going into the IIS manager and checking that programs like SMTPS, etc., have all been installed and are running properly is extremely important. But both of these things are possible causes for why none of the services are running, and it's recommended that Robert checks both of them.